So at this point, you did learn a lot about crucial Angular essentials, and you did learn how to build Angular applications, at least basic applications. And of course, we're going to dive deeper into Angular and into more advanced features throughout this course. However, when we explored those essentials in the previous sections, we worked with so-called standalone components, which is just one kind of component you can build in Angular apps. And even though it's the nowadays recommended way of building Angular components, and it's the most modern way of building Angular components and of combining components, there also exists an alternative because you can also use so-called Angular modules for grouping components together and for structuring your application. And this feature exists mostly for historic reasons, because in the past, and also when Angular 2 was released in 2016, Angular modules were the only way of building Angular apps or of combining Angular components. And therefore, a lot of projects still use this approach. And therefore, in this section, you will learn what exactly Angular modules are and how you can create and use them, and how you can use them to combine components instead of using standalone components. You will learn how to declare and export components in modules and why you would want to do that. And you will learn how to combine multiple modules and how to share module functionalities, though this will all, of course, make more sense once you understand what exactly Angular modules are. So let's dive into that. Now, to explore the concept of Angular modules, I'm back in that Essentials application we worked on in the last course section. So it's the same application, you find a snapshot attached, and I can of course start this application after installing the dependencies with npm install, and I then get this app we worked on in the previous section. And now I want to migrate this application to use Angular modules instead of standalone components. So what's the idea behind Angular modules? Well, as I mentioned, it's a feature that mostly exists for historic reasons, though you can absolutely still use it today, if you, for example, prefer it over standalone components, or if you are working on some project that simply uses modules because it maybe always used modules, or because it's using an older version of Angular. And the idea behind Angular modules in the end is that you don't specify on a per component level, as you do it with standalone components, which components that component uses in its template. So for example, with standalone components, if my app component in its template uses my custom header component and the user component and the tasks component, I have to specify these components in this imports array of the app component if I'm dealing with standalone components. And instead of doing that on a per component level, with modules, you instead create a module that simply combines all the components that need to work with each other, you could say. So that your component decorators and the configuration you pass to your components gets leaner because you don't need this imports array, for example, when working with Angular modules, but you instead have those extra modules. The downside of this approach is that whilst the component decorators get a bit leaner, it's not immediately obvious which component uses which other components, and you have to create those extra modules, which is not necessarily an advantage. But let's not waste too much time here. Instead, let's simply migrate this Essentials project here to use Angular modules, and along the way, you'll therefore learn how to work with those modules, how to create them, and how they differ from standalone components. Though I also want to mention that you can mix and match standalone components and modules if you wanted to, but you'll also see that in action soon. So back in this project, let's now create such a module. And what you typically do in every Angular app that uses Angular modules is that you create a root app module, typically next to the root app component. So here next to the app component TS file, I create a app.module.ts file. Again, following that naming convention you've seen over and over again throughout the course, where the file name contains a description of what's inside that file, in this case a module. Well then, a module, as so often in Angular, is just a class that gets exported. And as components or services, the name of the class should have an identifier like app, if it's the main app root module, and then a description of what exactly this class is about, and in this case it will be a module. So the name would be app module. Again, not for technical reasons, you could name it whatever you want, but that's the convention you typically see in Angular. Well, and then also, as you often see it in Angular, you decorate this class with a special decorator. And that special decorator is imported from @Angular core, and it's the ng module decorator that must be imported here. And that's then added with that @ symbol to this class. Now, like most decorators, this decorator takes a configuration object where you now configure this module. Because I mentioned that modules would be the things you set up to group components together. So one essential configuration that must be done with help of that module is that you add a declarations array to its configuration. Because it's that array where you will declare and register all the components, for example, that need to work together. I'm saying for example because you could also add directives here, but we will learn more about directives later in the course, so for now it's components we want to focus on. Well, and which components do want to work together in our app? Well, essentially all components. Now, for more complex applications, you could create multiple modules that work together, and we'll do that a little bit later in this section. But for a start, let's start with all components here. And here, for a start, I will declare the app component, because that is definitely one of the components we have in our application that should be considered by Angular. Therefore, I will import the app component from /app component, so from the app component TS file, and add it here to declarations. Now, as I do that, I'm then getting an error that the component app component is standalone and cannot be declared in a ng module. Because indeed modules and standalone components are rivaling concepts. So if we add a component to the declarations array, it can't be a standalone component. Therefore, what we have to do is go to the app component TS file and remove this standalone true property here. Or set it to standalone false, which is the default though. Therefore, removing it also works. With that, you then see that I'm also getting an error here in that component now, that the imports array is only valid if a component is standalone, which this component isn't anymore. So we should remove that from the app component as well. And then, of course, we can also remove those imports here because we're not using these component class identifiers in this file anymore. So with that, this app component decorator got leaner. However, now our application also would crash. And it would actually crash for multiple reasons. So let's fix this. So why is the application crashing now that I added the app component to a module? Well, because that's not all we have to do here. Keep in mind that earlier in this course, I mentioned that it would be the main.ts file that gets executed first. And in that file, we're telling Angular with which component we want to start our Angular app. So what our root component should be. Well, this approach only works if that root component is a standalone component. So if we're not using modules here. And of course, that's not the case anymore. App component isn't a standalone component anymore. And therefore, indeed, if you're working with a root Angular module instead of standalone components, you don't start your Angular application like this. Instead, we can get rid of all these imports and completely empty this file, and instead import something from @Angular platform browser dynamic. And from there, we have to import the platform browser dynamic function. And then this function must be executed, and on the result of calling that function, you can then call bootstrap module. And you now need to pass a reference of that class here, so the class name in the end, to this bootstrap module function now. So we should import the app module from, and then from the app folder and the app module file, and pass that to the bootstrap module function. And that's how you then start an Angular application that uses modules. However, we're not entirely there yet because we also must add the root module now. Because at the moment, Angular just knows that it's this app module with which the Angular application should be started, but it does not know which of the components that are declared here should be the root component. Of course, at the moment, we only have one component here, but that will soon change because we will soon add more components here to tell Angular which other components might be used by the app component. And therefore, theoretically, we would have multiple components here and Angular wouldn't know with which component to start the app. That's why to the root Angular module, you also must add a special bootstrap configuration item. And this now also takes an array, and it takes an array of all the root components you want to set up for your application. And whilst this could be multiple components, it's typically just one, because you typically just build Angular applications that consist of a single tree of components. So in my case, I specify the app component here so that Angular knows that this is the root component with which I want to start the application. Well, with that, if we try to load our application again, or if we take a look at the terminal where we have that ng-serve process up and running, we see that we still get some errors here. For example, that Angular doesn't know the app tasks component now, which we're using in the template of the app component. So that's something else we'll have to fix.